What's up, everybody? Welcome to Conversations with me, your host, Jason Glaze. Hey, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you subscribe, hit that like button, drop a comment, help our algorithms get us in front of as many people as possible. If you're listening to us on iTunes or Spotify, welcome. This is part 2 of my conversation with my dear friend, Scott Althauser. This is a good one. We talk about so much good stuff. Just through Scott's story, we talk about his experience with grace and identity. We go back into addiction and talk about that some more. Let me tell you something. You're really going to want to hang in there to the end. The last 15 minutes are gold, especially if you're a leader or a parent. So I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I know you will too. Scott Althauser, are you ready for part 2?
Part 2.
I'm fired up.
Let's do it.
Hey, if you have not watched part 1 with my conversation with Scott, make sure you go back and watch it. Fascinating conversation where we basically took Scott's story and we talked about addiction and addiction to drugs and religion, how that worked together, spirituality, what we're really looking for. It was really, really cool. So go back and catch part 1 if you have not watched it. All right, so part 2, just a little recap.
Okay.
We basically looked at your early church experiences.
Right.
And how you got addicted to religion really young through a bunch of fear. Mm-hmm. Fear, and we know that when you got fear, shame's going to be on the heels pretty quick.
Yeah.
So fear and shame kind of was the backdrop of your life growing up, and you were addicted to religion, and then you got addicted to drugs, and those two things had a weird little dance.
They did.
Right?
Yeah.
And then you finally hit your brokenness, ended up at No Longer Bound, which is, tell people the skinny on what No Longer Bound is.
It's a 12-month, what they call a 12-month regeneration center, right? And they would contrast that to the idea of rehabilitation, which is to return to a former state. And really, it's just the classic Christian story of the new birth, the new creation, right? That you don't need to return to anything. You need something brand spanking new.
Yeah. And so you ended up at No Longer Bound, and you begin to get, I know this is a buzzword in today's culture, but you really went through a deconstruction,
right? In
a good way.
Yeah.
Right? Deconstruction can be beautiful if it's done in the right setting with the right leadership.
Right.
Beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It's dangerous if you don't have the right leadership and the right structure, but you basically went through a deconstruction where God was left and his love was left and everything else was kind of stripped away. Anything else we kind of need to know?
Well, as a quick comment, I would say deconstruction is always dangerous. Doesn't matter if you got the right group around you or not. It's always dangerous, and it's always painful. And it's also not, I don't think that it's supposed to be the last step. So I'm a reconstructionist at heart, right?
Beautiful.
Yeah. Love it. But also, I just, for anyone that didn't watch the first one, I just wanted to stress how much of a religious addict I was, both addicted to religion, but also religious in my addiction and in my approach to addiction. So I would stay up all night high on all sorts of things and just debating, just tooth and nail debating, looking for debates with people about the Bible, which is weird enough. But then I would also, I would play on the worship team, be out all night, no sleep, on all sorts of substances, and then come play worship music, leading people in worship music. And it would just, again, it started out as a pendulum, but then for some reason they started to merge, and I would try to straddle both worlds, right? Which just got me psychotic after a while and really did some damage to my concept of God and self and others. But you mentioned fear leading to shame. For me, I remember the fear for sure. In fact, some of my earliest memories, this is kind of a strange one, but some of my earliest memories are of fear of God and fear of hell. Like some of my earliest conscious memories are feeling that fear. So that's strange. And it was helpful to hear somebody say that fear is basically desire, like with a negative sign in front of it, right? That I was desiring something, but I was also terrified. And then shame came in both subtly, but also it came in very precisely with an instance of sexual shame that I experienced that then what we were just talking about before the recording was that pretty much was the end of my story. And this happened when I was young, probably 8 years old. And it just, all that really happened was a playing out of shame.
Exactly.
Of this one shame. Now, I compounded it with shame on shame on shame. But it started just with one that I knew. I'd already had the fear. Then I confirmed the fear that I did the thing that was unforgivable. And now I just have to live with it and then work my butt off trying to come back from it and try to earn something back.
Fig leaves, baby.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, fig leaves.
Yes.
All right, so let's talk about some of your micro experiences, because I think we got a good grasp in conversation one about the macro experience of No Longer Bound.
Right.
Now I think I want to back up and let's get some of the micro experiences, and then let's get into your internship, and then even going on staff and like what that journey was like. What did you learn about God's self and just the healing and growth?
Yeah. Well, I mean, even going into that place, I look back now and think, I'm sure everyone else knew more about me than I did and knew what they were in for. But like, I'm the only person that I know of who wrote their introductory letter to try to get accepted into this program. And I wrote a poem, an extended poem. It was very long.
Of course you did.
And very religious. Yeah, exactly. And I've recently found some of my old journals, like from high school, man, and it literally is just it's just a wrestling match between me and these concepts of God, and just like striving, to dig myself out of total depravity. And they told me when I first got there that the most difficult kind of addicted man to help is a religious addicted man.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah. And at the time I thought, all right, well, show me one of these guys, thank God, thank God that's not me. Cause I'm a young guy. I've dabbled in some drugs or whatever, but I've got a pretty sound framework here when it comes to my theology, Yeah. And they were like, no, we were talking about you. And I was like, what? But you guys don't understand. I was born in the church, basically, went to a Christian school my entire life. Everyone that I knew, everyone that I've ever known up to this point has been a Christian, a Bible-believing Christian, right? So I'm sure those people are out there, but I'm not one of them. And what we mentioned in part one that I think was the beginning of the end for me, the beginning of the end of addiction to religion, was being forced to actually talk to God and listen to God and write down an answer as if it was from God. And the second part was they came and took away my Bible. And I still remember who it was. He's still one of my best friends to this day, one of my all-time best friends. But he came into the little room where I was staying in, and you got all these roommates or whatever. And if you ever wanted to find me, if you couldn't find me, you'd find me in my room reading my Bible. I even had a plan of how I would read through the entire Bible throughout this year that I was trapped in this place. But I thought the best part about it is I will come out of here with more effective memorization of the
more
words
knowledge
of God. Right.
More knowledge.
Right. Yeah. And this individual who I won't name, this friend of mine, he came in and he said, hey, we're going to take that away from you now. And I said, if you take this away from me now, I'm leaving this place. He said, well, that's going to be your decision, but we're going to take away maybe the last and most powerful drug that you have, which is really certainty, but at the time, the scriptures. And I remember this is one of those micro moments, and there's so many of these micro moments that happen when you're in a situation like this. And I also believe that God is hyper deliberate. I think he's always hyper deliberate, but it seems even more hyper deliberate when you're in a place like this. Yeah. So like every day something is happening where he is trying to get your attention.
Right.
But this time, this individual said, hey, do you think that reading that book is going to get you better? It's going to make you better? And I thought he was joking. I didn't even answer it at first because I'm like, what? Of course the answer is yes. Yeah. Like, obviously the answer is yes. This is God in a book. And he said, it's not. It's actually making you worse. And I don't know how many of your listeners could maybe appreciate that dynamic, to have to remove the Bible because it is in the way in between you and God. Yeah. And that you and God will not be able to connect and to unify and to relate to one another as long as that Bible's in the way.
I think half of people listen to this will get it and half won't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for the ones that don't, I get it too, because
I understand.
I was about to run.
Yeah.
Like, you're taking the only thing that we've got to go off of. And if you remove that, then what else are we going to be talking about here? And how am I going to feel safe knowing that I can trust this, right? And so what ended up happening is I had to learn how to trust other men. And realizing that I didn't trust anybody, and I also didn't trust myself. And so really the whole recipe is bound to fail. It's just bound to explode, because I can say that my relationship to this book is going to make me better, but I don't trust my own ability to even interpret what's here.
Right.
So once they removed it, some of the micro moments that started to unfold from there really are just a combination of relational, experiential, and just good old spiritual practice, right? Just praxis. And if there's a hierarchy to, like, you know, if propositional content lives up here and it's kind of like the top layer, the icing on the cake, participatory experience is like the baseline level of knowing, of entering into some sort of new, whatever it is, new communion, new community, new relationship. So what happened was, what I didn't realize was happening is they shoved me into the participatory realm, where it's like, none of these things matter anymore. Like, we don't care. Shut up. Stop talking about it. Like, right? We don't care. Just get up and go over there and hug those men. And then listen to them, you know?
And that's big, because we don't know how to do relationships and addiction.
Right.
And I remember just seeing, like, a guy would be there like day one and he's barely detoxed, and your job was to hug him every time you see him. And it's freaking him out, right?
Yeah.
But we don't know how to receive love because we don't feel worthy of it. And so the relational component to getting sober, talk more about that. Like, what went on with you relationally on how you learned how to interact with others and how that played a part in your sobriety?
Sure. You know, again, I think I said this in part one. I feel like my answers to that are going to sound so simple and basic.
That's okay.
But I had to start that simple. So we mentioned, like, sliding a piece of paper that just had a list of emotions, and realizing that, like, oh, I've only got 2 words for emotions up to this point. I've got, like, fine and pissed, you know, and that's it. If I'm not pissed, I'm fine. And if I'm not fine, I'm pissed, and that's it. Right. So it plays out similarly with relationships. Things that I think on paper are going to sound almost childish, almost infantile, like, look at somebody when they're talking to you, and look at them when you're talking back to them. So a practice like that, and this might seem like a suggestion, but it's not. It is actually a fundamental, enforceable practice at this place called No Longer Bound, to where if I'm talking to you and I start doing this, someone will stop and say, "Hey, Scott, look at him." And then I'll be like, "What?" And you, like, have to make eye contact. So again, that sounds like an infantile prescription, but if anybody starts to try this is a basic form of relational connection that creates intimacy so quickly, it's almost unbelievable. And then if you combine that with physical touch, so eye contact, you could call it something like time or attention, right? That we really do share something with each other when we engage through our eyes, those windows of the soul. But then, like you mentioned, the very first day I got there, which of course is just a horribly depressing feeling when you realize where you are, right? And what you just signed up for. And that it doesn't matter what you think you want tonight for dinner. It's not up to you. And it doesn't matter if you want a cigarette. It's not up to you, right? It's a heavy load. And I remember just this crushing, like, realization of where I am and what got me here. And then as I walked down the hill, as they say, at No Longer Bound, every human that saw me, not only did they stop what they were doing and change their direction to come towards me, right? Which is unsettling. Like, if you were to just walk at the mall and everybody who looked at you started just moving towards you, it's a weird feeling. But they would stop and they would move towards me as if they were on a mission to get to me. And then when they would get very close to me, I would say, you know, "Hey there, my name's Scott," or whatever. And they would push my hand away and then come in for an embrace. And usually an awkwardly long embrace. Like, if you've ever hugged somebody you care about, just try adding 10 seconds to it. And then you cross a threshold from, like, no, we were here to say hi and greet each other with a hug, versus now we're embracing each other. And, you know, especially if you, like, get a little neck contact, a little cheek to cheek, right? And this was day one. So day one, what they were doing is they were exposing me to the basics of any intimate relationship without telling me what they were doing. They were just looking at me in the eyes and you could tell that like they look through you, right? And I remember that to this day, that the whole like first week, it was like these people are just staring into me and it's uncomfortable. But then they come and hug me, unusually long hugs, and then they say, we're glad you're here, and then they walk away.
Yeah.
Third component, first one we could call time. That would be this attention, this present attention. Second one we could call touch.
I got a story on the touch part I want to share.
Okay.
So before I went to No Longer Bound and did my little time there, and I did not go through the complete program like y'all did. Sure. Like I said in part one, you kind of modified a little outpatient program for me. I think I might have been the only one you ever did that for.
You're one of two.
One of two.
My younger brother Anthony, who did it for me.
Okay,
too,
yeah. But so this was before that. But I was very connected with No Longer Bound. Had friends there. I'd been there to speak at the food program where they used to give food away.
Yeah.
But I was in this closet alcoholism that nobody knew. And then with addiction comes with everything else, betrayal and all this stuff. And in the worst of my pain, I was actually, one of the 2 times in my life I've been suicidal was this season when I was in the midst of my pain, and I was trying to figure out how to plan a suicide where Kim would get insurance money, right? And people from No Longer Bound was blowing my phone up, and I'm not answering. And finally, Mike Harden, the founder, he calls, and I didn't answer. He leaves a voicemail, and he said, you might ignore everybody else's phone call, but you will not ignore mine. Get your ass on this property. And so I was actually out of town at the time, but when I came back, I drove up and got out of my truck, and here come 3 or 4, 5 guys out of the houses, Redeemer, and what was the one across from the Redeemer?
Yeah, the White House.
Zoe, the White House, yeah.
And Zoe down there.
Yeah, here everybody comes and just embraced me. And I think those hugs probably saved my life.
Right.
So it's crazy how simple things God created, like touch.
Yeah.
And what they mean in certain moments. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think I remember that.
Yeah.
And second of all, you're right. There is something that, like, I think I knew within 1 hour of arriving at this, year-long place that I knew nothing about. I think I knew within 1 hour that this not only is the place where I need to be and the perfect place where I need to be, but I even knew that like this is going to change my life, and that everything that I think that I had been looking for and hoping for, I hate to say it this crudely, but everything that I personally had been looking for in church, I now found in the fellowship of suffering, right? In the collection of the scum of the earth, right? And I realized that like, this is it. This could be the real thing. And obviously that got tested 2 other times because of my theology. It was a slow death, but I remember that I knew it. Like I remember thinking, as soon as I am able to contact my family, I have to tell them, hey, I found a real place that exists where total strangers walk up to each other, no matter what has happened. If they were just in a screaming, yelling match, they will end the argument with an embrace, a man-to-man embrace. Yeah. And so that, number 1, eye contact. Number 2, touch. Third is time, touch, talk. And you might say, okay, well, I mean, there's all sorts of talking that happens at No Longer Bound, right? And talk therapy is, it's one of the modes that we have to share our inner selves with other people. So obviously talk is not, it's a big category. But if someone were to say, okay, well, like what kind of talk would save your life or would make you feel love, acceptance, and worth? It's literally these strangers would say, I love you. They started telling me I love you, but before they knew anything about me. And so it's easy to dismiss that as like, sure, you think you do until you actually know me, and then you won't. And so that had to be tested too. Yeah. But it still sticks out to me as these 3 most basic ways of building the 4th T, which would be trust. And trust happened so quickly for me that, again, I lived most of my life not trusting anybody. And what was interesting to me about the trust factor is, number 1, I could actually feel it as it was happening. Whereas a lot of times when we think about trust, it's kind of an abstract thing. Like sometimes we feel it, sometimes we don't. Most times I think we choose to trust things, like, which just means I don't trust this, but I'm going to gamble on it, right?
Right.
Like, I'm going to choose to trust my wife that she's not going to cheat on me today. Just means I think she probably will, but I'm going to choose to trust that she won't.
Sure.
But for me, I started to realize that the trust was forming all by itself and took no effort on the part of my will. That I started to really deeply trust these men because they seemed to stop everything that they were doing and give me their full attention every time I was nearby. From the founder all the way down to the whatever the youngest leader there was. They would, as if I was the priority of their whole day, of their whole world. Second, they would hug me before and after any exchange of any kind. And then they would end it with, "And I love you, Scott," right? Was not used to that. I come from a very loving family, really. So it's not that was new.
But from strangers.
But from strangers
Yeah.
that I knew were also a bunch of drug addicts, right? Like, I really had the impression that when you get to a place like this, there's all the drug addicts.
And then there's the healthy people.
And then there's the righteous, healthy people leading the drug addicts, right? And as soon as I realized, no, this is the blind leading the blind here. But yet I deeply admired these men. And then as soon as I was done, they would turn around and there'd be another new person and they would move right up to that guy, stop everything they were doing, touch, talk, right? And I realized this isn't a gimmick. This isn't something they do just for like new people to make them feel welcome in their first day or their first week. Not that everyone's going to feel welcome to get hugged by a bunch of strangers.
No.
It's also off-putting at first.
Yeah, you feel like you hug somebody and it feels like they swallowed a curtain rod.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or you just get full side hugs. It's just everything to try to avoid it, but you get a little bit of it. And these people, I mean, I'm not even exaggerating here. They would make you fully hug them, right? Like these were enforceable practices. Like, no, where's that other arm? Put it around me. I want to feel it,
Yeah.
Anyway,
And
so
you're learning how to receive love.
Yeah, I mean, learning how to be hugged, how to let yourself be hugged. It's such a, technically, I guess, maybe we're in more of a receptive, passive, maybe even, I want to say the word feminine, but I'm scared to say it just because those loaded words. But you're in a receptive mode, and to let a big old stranger just hug you, I mean, that's hard to get used to.
But it is the pipeline to receiving God's love, but you don't know it.
Exactly.
Like learning how to receive love from another human, and then when it's time to receive His love.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think you and Robbie talked about that, about the conduit concept.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I needed it from people, man. I needed it bad from people because I was trying to just do me and God and cut the people out.
Oh, me too.
And just preferred it that way too.
Oh, I can show you journals where I'm trying to get sober, just me and Jesus.
Yeah.
And He's literally pushing, it feels like He was pushing me away from Him to you.
Yeah.
I can show you your name in a journal where Jesus is saying, go talk to Scott Althauser. And I'm like, I can work this out, just me and you. And He's like, no, we're not going to do it that way. He was not going to let me isolate with Him and get sober.
Right.
Just wasn't going to do it.
And it feels so much, it feels like a burden and it feels like an unnecessary one. Like, wait, you're obviously talking to me because you're telling me something, but you're telling me to stop talking to you and go feed my sheep or go give somebody some water or, whatever. But then I don't know about you, but for me, as I started to engage in that as a participation, a practice of participation with real human beings, I started to realize this is good. It's the thing I've been searching for, right? And obviously there is a through line it scales up to the highest.
Yeah.
But for me, I needed it boots on the ground. I needed it like raw and real. And like some of the raw and realness that started to play out with me is like a micro story for me was when I say I was a religious addict, I mean that I could be out using every illicit drug I could get my hands on, lying to everyone, lying, stealing, cheating, whatever. And yet I also would like never say a swear word. I don't think I had ever said a swear word before getting into No Longer Bound, right?
We're going to shoot cocaine, but we ain't going to cuss.
Exactly. Because we know how God feels about that, right?
So great. I love that so much.
And I still know people. I won't name names, but I still know people who, it is funny how our judgments and vows, how we get them so structured and so defined, and we feel like, as long as we are keeping these things, we're doing all right. And for me, as long as I wasn't swearing, I was not out of control of my emotions. I wasn't out of control in general.
Right.
Because taming the tongue, it's a fire, and I've somehow got it licked. That's a nice pun. But they did this thing, they used to call it the sociogram, now they call it the evaluation. It's a peer-to-peer evaluation. They did it once a week. It's basically asking like 30 other men to call you out on everything that they see that you've been doing wrong that week, but then also affirming you for everything that you've done right that week. And so it's a grueling process, right? They did it every single week. And I remember this one guy in the program who, man, I'd love to see him one day. It's been some years. But this one man would give me what they called a negative vote or a negative insight every single week for being fake and phony. Every single week. And this is for weeks in a row, right? And he's calling me out for being fake and phony. And then I'm like, all right, well, let me show you what authenticity looks like, right? I'm going to go out of my way this week to be a real authentic person. Like, I'm going to come and, share all this stuff with that person specifically and make sure that he can see me being authentic, right? You see the irony in this.
Oh, yeah.
And so I don't know if he got other people to gang up on me or what, but there was this one week after weeks of this where it started out as just him, but then other people started doing it, calling me out for being fake and phony. And so there was this, during this kind of format, there would be a break in between where you could go outside and get right with people. Man, all this stuff on paper just sounds like it's disastrous. People always ask me like, how many fights would break out? And the answer is like none. It's amazing. But we went outside during this break, and I finally went up to this guy for the first time in probably 5 weeks. And I came right up to him and I said, what the F is wrong with you? Right? It was my first time ever dropping an F-bomb.
Yeah.
And I didn't mean to do it. It just came right out. And I was ready to fight this guy. I was ready to just, I don't know. So I said, what the F is wrong with you? Only I said the word, right? Yeah. I'm not going to make your guy bleep it. But, okay. And this dude started smiling and started clapping.
Finally, he's thinking.
He said, here he is. We finally get to meet Scott. And then some other guys that were kind of around him turned and they said, what's going on? And he said, guess what? Scott's finally getting real. He's finally getting angry, let it come out. And they all start clapping. And again, it's this upside down world where I thought first, like, what are you guys even talking about? And then realized they were affirming me and saying, we're proud of you for breaking your own law, right? And doing it unintentionally, like actually letting something come out. And what stuck out to me so much is he was the one. I was saying this at him, and he was the one saying it'd be different if some other counselor was like, "Oh, I heard it. Hey, well done, Scott." All right, but it went against my theology, my religious upbringing for sure, and it went against every relational, relational law, really, ritualized relationships where you don't go yell and cuss at somebody, and if you do, you're asking for trouble. And this dude smiled, clapped, and then hugged me. Hugged me longer than he'd hugged me before, whispered in my ear, said, I'm so proud of you today. Today's a big day for you, and I'm just like, what is going on? Where am I? Like, what is going on here? And then slowly started to realize it actually started to get harder, because I started to realize that means I have to really let go of everything that I think that I know about a relationship with anything, with any other being other than me. If this can really be real, people can affirm me for being a mess, right? And for breaking my own laws, that I've obviously got this thing backwards. And the amount of love and acceptance that I felt in that moment was profound for me. I think every other version of acceptance that I had experienced was highly conditional. And so I knew what I had to do to get it. And I think, at times in my life, I would work hard to do those things and get it. But this was just a whole new thing where somehow or another, I'm being accepted without earning any of it. In fact, with trying my best not to be. Acceptance
is not acceptance unless it's unconditional.
Well,
if there's any condition to acceptance, you're talking about something else.
Yeah, I agree. You're actually talking about rejection.
Yeah.
That's what's so weird about it. Is we can talk about these needs, but we don't usually say, yeah, we need love, acceptance, and worth security, but we need them unconditionally, because otherwise we're actually being wounded.
Yep.
You are being wounded. Yep. And not only are you being wounded, but it's more diabolical than that, because then you're actually associating this need with this artificial counterfeit version of it.
Yep.
Right. And it doesn't satisfy, and you're going to need to try harder to get it next time. And you also know that you can lose it.
Yep.
So for me, if somebody were to ask me, what is the opposite of worth? I would say that the opposite of worth is shame. And so I had shame in areas that I didn't even realize. I had areas that I knew I had shame. And when someone started to introduce me to the idea of shame that you're well familiar with, because guilt is good.
Oh, yeah.
Guilt's a good thing. But shame, obviously, will eat you alive, right? It's a poison. But what I didn't realize is that shame had spread out into every aspect of my life, not just the ones where I knew I had done something shameful.
It becomes a backdrop.
It becomes a backdrop for all of the conditional ways that I was getting my worth or trying to get my worth. Were all conditional, whether it was God, my family, teachers, coaches, pastors, anybody that you could name in my life. It was all heavily conditional, and No Longer Bound for me was my first exposure through the very simple things of time, touch, and talk to really God's agape, God's unconditional love. And I'm so glad that God didn't descend from the heavens and appear in my room and tell me these things. I'm so glad that he used a bunch of messy men.
Yeah.
And I still, to this day, what I have now to show for it, I'm skipping over a ton here, but what I have to show for it is I still have those men.
Yeah.
And they're still around me all the time. And they're still my primary sources of a secondary need, right? They're still my through line.
Your conduit.
Yeah, my conduits. Yeah. And being well connected with conduits, is a beautiful thing.
So before we get into your internship or SLT, we'll just go ahead and call it SLT.
Servant leadership training.
Servant leadership training is what it used to be called. Right. They do an internship now?
They're bringing it back.
Bring it back, okay.
Yeah.
So, but back then, you went through the year-long program, and then you went through an SLT, Servant Leadership Program, for another year, correct?
Unpaid internship. Giving back what you got. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So before we get into the SLT experience, any other micro in the program that you think is important to bring out?
I mean, the answer is many, 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 many micro moments. The only things, if I were to just hit a couple of the highlights without getting into the stories surrounding them, right? Which feels kind of empty because the stories surrounding them matter, right? Like our personal stories matter. How God ambushes us by arranging these perfect storms of situations, right? Emotion, like these things would just happen all the time, and they would lead to a breaking open. So I'm going to skip all the story stuff, which is really where the meat is, in my opinion, and just hit a couple things like, for example, forgiveness is a real thing. Personally, I feel like a lot of the people that I know and interact with, the word forgiveness is either not in the vocabulary, or when it is used, we don't really know what we're talking about.
That's right.
And we wouldn't say that it's like a metaphysical reality, that reality itself changes on every level when forgiveness happens.
Absolutely.
And I think there's nothing wrong with saying that forgiveness is a process. Of course it is. I mean, once it happens, you can look back and see everything leading up to this moment and maybe get a glimpse of what could happen after this. But there are also moments, in the same way that, like, me, punching you in the face is a real thing that happens, right? It's not just a process. It is a process. Right. But like that can break our relationship, right? And then equally, there are moments that can reconcile a relationship. And for me, grieving was a huge one. Forgiveness was a huge one. And judgments and vows for me were pretty big too. But forgiveness was the biggest one because I can remember the feeling that I had after forgiving myself and receiving God's forgiveness. And I hate to say this one. Normally I would leave this one out. If I weren't talking to you, if I was talking to any other person, I would leave out the third one, but that is forgiving God.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Good. Hopefully your people, again, like the 50% can get on board with that. Maybe 50 can't.
Well, if the people who say that, if the idea of forgiving God bothers someone, I say, well, then just use the verbiage, let him off the hook.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But for some people, you got to go there.
Right.
Like you were holding something against God, and the only way to cancel that is to forgive.
That's right. Yeah. Not to mention, it might be the single thing that is our birthright as heirs to the kingdom is forgiveness.
Sure.
We can get into some scriptures, right? Like the last one, one of the last ones when he got everybody together, and he transfers this forgiveness ability. Not to mention, maybe the thing that got him killed was forgiving sins. So it's like all the other things that I was looking for out of Christianity, out of my religion, all the things I was looking for were like supernatural abilities, right? But I did not know that the most divine, the highest of all supernatural gifts that's been given to us is the ability to forgive, or maybe even the right to forgive. So for me, forgiving God was one of the most empowering and also like loving things that he like, and I had to ask his permission many times.
Sure.
Like first to sort out that forgiving God is not the same thing as him apologizing to me, right? That's not what we mean.
Right.
Even though we could go as far as to say, I mean, there have been moments where he has said to me, I'm sorry about this. Now, again, even that's different than him saying, I made a mistake.
Right.
But he can say, I am sorry.
Well, that's what empathy is.
Yeah. I'm so sorry about this.
Yes.
I'm sorry that this has happened to you. Right. So I just wanted to kind of stress, it's not even maybe a micro moment. For me, it was a total game changer, and something that when I mentioned in the first episode about writing my life story when I was 20, 21, writing it when I'm 40, some of the things that are hard for me to connect with back in my first half of my life is I can't get back into the state of unforgiveness.
Right.
It's almost like they say that about pain, that if you experience physical pain, once it's gone, you can't remember it. You can't get it back. You can remember all these aspects of what being in pain did to you or what it might have affected. Like I couldn't eat food, I couldn't smell, I couldn't get out of bed. But you can't bring back that pain. It's not possible. And you can't even, like, what does remembering that pain mean? Like, you can't feel it again. In the same way, I had one of these, like, actual forgiveness moments that maybe, like, the way that I'm trying to think of a good way to explain what it felt like. All I felt the next day is I remember I was carrying a bucket that was going to hold all these weeds that I was going to pull from a flower bed, because my job that day was to pull a bunch of weeds from a flower bed. And I remember walking up to the flower bed to start pulling these weeds and looking up and just feeling like, I'm pretty sure that I've never felt this way in my whole life, that I am exactly who I'm supposed to be and where I'm supposed to be, and that God and I are now officially good, right? And it was a vivid, visceral experience in my self-talk of, I think that everything I've been looking for and all the effort I've put into, and of course running and rebelling from, but all the effort I've put into, all the striving I've done, it finally has happened, and it didn't come through earning some sort of sense of salvation so that I can finally feel secure enough to not worry about hell or worry about my mistakes or my sins or my wounds or my trauma. It didn't even mean that all my wounds were healed. Didn't even mean that any of them were healed. It just means that not only everything I had done up to that point, but if there is any sense of like forgiving into the future, right? Which I know is a weird thing to talk about. One story it reminds me of is my wife went through a medical episode last year, and we got a bunch of medical debt. And I prayed and prayed that God would help us out of this medical debt. And then we got a letter in the mail a couple months later from the hospital, and it began with the sentence, "You are forgiven of," and then the dollar amount, and it was everything, right? And I thought, man, this is God talking to me. I could, as I read that sentence, I could hear his voice saying, "You are forgiven of this," because I had some guilt and shame around the way I had handled it, and I was so scared of the debt and everything. But the reason I'm saying this story is because they also said, and any medical procedures from now until like next March are also covered. And I thought, if that isn't a great symbol for God's forgiveness, that it can extend, we all know that it can extend as far back as we want. Yeah. Right. But I had the sense that like, I don't think there's anything that I can do to break this relationship again, because if he forgave me for those unforgivable things, then I can't think of anything else that would. That seed was planted through forgiveness. And to quote Paul, it got watered by you about a year later, a little less than a year later, when I was in that internship. That's when it started to get watered. But the seed was already there, and I knew it was there. And I had the sense that, like, there's no going back. Yeah. I'm fully forgiven. I've fully forgiven him. And from now on, we just need to just kind of stay caught up on the present. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm free to do that, or I'm also free not to do it. You know? So anyway.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. So now let's kind of carry on to the next part of your story when you did enter into the internship, because I know that was a big season in your life. And that's when, I think that's when I first met you.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
I had heard your name and knew of you because you and other people in your family and relationships that you had had. So I knew roughly who you were. And I knew that you were, you know, a counselor and things like that. And so.
And this is 2003, 2004. Something like that. Maybe 5?
Maybe 5 or even 6.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was 05, 06 when I was in the internship.
Okay.
And there was you were putting on one of these Exchange Life conferences. I don't know if it was with Grace Ministries International. I don't know if it was with Simply Grace, but Simply Grace probably. Yeah. So there was a conference, and I remember, I think it was Mike Harden saying, hey, who wants to go to this conference? You know, it's with people that we know and love, and you guys might get a kick out of it. And when you're in this internship, it's another year, it's unpaid internship. You're living on the campus, right? You're just giving back. You're basically like kind of the grunt, just carrying out all the dirty work. It also meant another year away from my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, but at the time had just gone a year without seeing her and talking to her. And then God said to stay. And I wept for about 3 weeks straight, just receiving this, okay, I need to stay and I need to do this. So thankful I did. Yeah. I mean, my life, I have no idea how to even picture my life apart from this one decision, not to come to the program, but to stay for that internship. And one of the reasons is because I met you. And I'm not trying to blow smoke. I really do mean that, well, God would have used some other people to water it, I'm sure. But within the context of that place that I still was, I needed it because some of these revelations, man, you know, they're heavy. These revies are heavy, right? And they really are. Yeah. And they can start to, I think that they can start to alienate a little bit, right? I mean, it can make it more difficult to jump back into whatever, you know, mainline Calvinist theology, let's say, which we talked about in the last episode. So I think that I needed to be in the place that I was with the people that I was in order for me to even receive this and for it to start to grow. I don't think it would have grown any other way, but I don't know. So, but the point is, that internship was difficult, but it was also beautiful. And encountering some of the things that you had said at this first conference, I went with a friend of mine, the same friend who had taken away my Bible months before, which had then been given back to me by then. But still, kind of like you, I found that when I went back to it, there was an emptiness, right? Which has since, of course, gone away. Now, like we said before, I think it's beautiful. But for a while there, it's like kind of like you said, he sucked all the life out of it and then just wasn't in a rush to give it back. And so it was still very experiential for me, very relational for me, very direct in my relationship with God and others and self. But I went to this conference. I volunteered to go because a night away from the campus when you're an intern, doesn't matter what it is, right? You'd be like, do you guys want to go somewhere and just sit and watch paint dry? The answer would be like, yes, let's watch it. It sounds amazing. So I went to this conference knowing that I was excited to kind of see who you finally were or whatever. But of course, you get up on the whiteboard and you start doing your thing. And you start drawing the lines, above the line, below the line. You start talking about, you know, really this exchange of spirit and the difference between that and every other form of flesh. And then realizing that, everything that I called my spirituality was just my flesh, you know? Like, there was no spirit at work here, right? Everything, self-effort or self-denial or self-condemnation, self-righteous, self-everything, you know? And you started just putting stuff on the board that really excited me to my core. Like to the point where I remember like uncontrollably starting to cry at various times when you'd be talking. Like when you really hear what I would call the better news, right? Then the good news is truly good, but I was hearing it in a way that was better. And it really, I could tell right away that if any of what this guy is saying is true, even close to true, then I've been missing it, and I need to hear this. You said I raised my hand once during that conference and asked some sort of question. I think it was just a matter of like something to do with, hey, you know, when I'm thinking this way, or my mind is going in this direction, how do I pivot? How do I switch it over to the mind of Christ? You know, you'd be saying things like the mind of Christ and stuff. And this was the only exchange that we had during that conference. And you just looked at me and you said, you need to stop taking credit for your own thoughts. You need to stop taking responsibility for every thought that comes into your head.
Yeah.
And it just literally blew my mind. All my thoughts just like disappeared for a second, and it left me with a question. It begs the question, well, then what am I if not my thoughts, right? It just leaves a huge question mark.
Yep.
Wherever, like, you know, I was in the business of trying my best to take thoughts captive, you know, and lead them into submission to Christ. But to not take responsibility for them.
To take thoughts captive, to ask the question, where did that thought come from?
Yeah, right.
And most of them don't come from me.
Right.
And I'm not my thoughts. Yeah.
Even the ones that you could say do come from me, I'm not sure how I generated them. You know, it's
Sure.
like, but that thought or that truth was so foreign to me. Even going through a year and a half of recovery work, where you're really digging into your thoughts and analyzing these thoughts, and you are looking for where did these come from, right? So plenty of that. Like, you could tell me the different sources of thoughts and I'd go into them, but for some reason, just separating my concept of myself, my identity,
Your identity,
from all of this whirlwind of chaos that goes on up here, and saying you don't need to own those things, was one of the most freeing things that happened to me. And because it begged a question, or because one of my favorite quotes is that a wise man's question contains half the answer.
Okay.
Right. And to me, what that implies, or what that means, is that if you ask the right question, what they call a leading question that leads you somewhere, that it already has the answer in it. It already has the implication of the answer in it, and the path itself that it's going to send you on is the answer. In the same way that in the first episode I was saying that I don't think God is as in the business of answering things as I thought he was. He's actually in the business of asking questions, right? And that his wise questions contain half the answer.
Sure.
But the answer becomes the path, right, of answering the question, not the answer itself. I had plenty of answers. I had way too many answers.
I would say even if his question doesn't contain half the answer, his question contains what's most important.
Yeah, exactly. Something better than the answer.
Something better than the answer.
I could give you an answer now, but it'd be selling you short.
Yeah.
Right. And so that, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here and say that like that. I really do believe that I can see a change of path from being exposed to that conference that has actually continued to lead me to where I am today, wherever that is. And I'm not at a place, I'm just still on a path.
Sure.
But I've been on that path ever since. And it's not just the path of addiction recovery, right? Because I can tell the addiction story. I love talking about the addiction story. I love being in relationship with men who are coming out of addiction. I love it. Love everything about it. That's still my world. It's my community. But that's not just the path that I'm talking about. There is the path of recovery, but I mean the path of actual union with God, which, you know, you can go your whole life in recovery and be sober.
Oh yeah.
You can go your whole life in religion, right? But for me, this idea of partaking in God himself, right? The Eastern Church would call it deification or theosis. But for me, without any of that language, it was just, okay, if I'm not my thoughts, then what am I? And if you put somebody on that search, you know, it leads you to God.
Yes.
Because God is, well, I ended up finding that God was within me, which was the absolute last place. Literally within me. And so not occasionally when the moment's right, when I'm right, descending upon me to touch my head or to anoint my forehead with oil or to make me say something for a certain person. But it put me on a path of then what am I? And then and who am I? Which inevitably, in my opinion, leads to whose are you? And that's what it started to do. Is it started to, okay, so I'm sober now. Okay, so I've got real relationships with other men that I would cherish, that I wouldn't give for anything. And hey, now at least this previous concept of God has been broken down, and there's really just a few things left over, right? Because God is not a concept. So that had already happened. It had been replaced with a relationship, in the same way that I had a concept of what having a wife would be like. I had a concept of a wife, and now I have an actual living, breathing human female that I love named Allison. But she's not my wife in the sense that she's a concept. And anytime she has to compete with my concept of a wife, still to this day, she can feel it. If I'm like, wait, this isn't what a wife is supposed to be like, right? And she's like, who are you talking about? It's just me now, right? And in the same way, that had happened where I had given up, I deconstructed and given up and subtracted all of my concepts of God, but it really had not been replaced with much. The same thing with myself. So that question set me on the path. Obviously, there was more to that conference and more that was said and more that really started to open my eyes to what this divine dance is all supposed to be about. But it took a few years after that, and a lot of that was having you alongside me, but also having a lot of other men still no longer around to kind of help me navigate this journey of union with God, of becoming one with God, or letting Him become one with you. And that was one of the first things that happened after that question. Is I was reeling from that, and I got into intense debates with the other no longer bound men that came with me to that event. I would say if you were to just poll everybody, for some reason, the majority of the group were like, this is some greasy grace, right? Like whatever this was, I think we need to stay away from this, right? Because what it's going to do is it's going to lead us back into addiction. Sure. If you start to buy into some of this grace, you will be dead in a ditch quickly, right?
When the truth is, there's no such thing as greasy grace. You can get over into licensed, what Scripture calls license. Sure. But now you've left grace. Yeah. You can't get. There's no such thing as an extreme of a grace state. Right. People that use the words like greasy grace, they're talking about something else that's not grace. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Because we know the fruit that grace produces. Oh, for sure. And so, yeah, if you're, for me at least, what the grace aspect did, what that whole exchange life message and this concept of grace did, is it started to lead me into this revelation of who I really am. And again, I wasn't ready for it right then, but I also could tell, number one, that all these other men that came with me, that were all interns, none of them could receive it. I mean, it produced a real response in them, and that was one of fear and anger. Yeah. And danger, like caution. And to the point to where when we were going back in the van, the discussion was, we're not going to talk about this stuff when we get back there. We're not going to talk about it to the leadership and tell them what actually happened in this conference. We're not going to talk about it to the residents. Like, we're just going to keep our mouths shut. And for me, I feel like, I don't, this might be an assumption, I'd have to ask these men, but for me, I feel like I was the only one who was like, oh my God, this is good. Like, I am so glad that this just happened tonight. Like, this could change everything for me, right? And so how it starts to manifest, of course, over time is this idea of, who was it? Is it Steve McVey that long quote about that it's impossible for a man to consistently behave in a manner contrary to who he believes himself to be? I thought you said that. I thought that was an original Scott Althauser. Oh, I might have just made it longer, unnecessarily long and complicated. It was probably a nugget from somebody from like Grace Walk, and then I just made it long for no reason. But it really does go back to this, like, if I believe myself to be primarily an addict, or go back further to total depravity, like we were talking about before, if I believe myself to be primarily and fundamentally a sinner, which I know this gets very controversial. This is controversial ground. But that if I believed myself primarily to be an addict, then I would continue to behave like an addict. And that does not mean continuing to use drugs and alcohol. It could also mean continuing to hold on to my sobriety and fight for it
every single day to make sure that I don't get drunk and high and end up dead in a ditch. That's still behaving like an addict.
Right. Yeah, the whole idea, and this is where I know, like you and I love our relationship because we can disagree on things and still love each other with no anger.
Sure.
But I still believe total depravity is a real thing. I do believe it is a truth. I think where the theology falls short is that's who I was. It's not who I am now. So I think the one of the fears about embracing the idea of total depravity is, okay, now Jesus has just cleaned me up, and I'm still totally depraved. No, I'm a new creature in Christ Jesus, holy, perfect, righteous, complete, and one with Him. I was depraved, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
But at some point, you have to receive that fully, right?
Sure.
So I mean, there can be moments where you look back and say, I was, but now I'm not. But that still has to be received somehow real time to your core. So it's not just that I am less depraved. Right. It's not just that I'm moving towards whatever the opposite of depravity is. I'm moving towards righteousness. Is that you have to, it's almost like you have to receive it before you believe it. It's almost like you have to receive it before any of the behaviors come that prove it, right? And it's like that; those behaviors will flow from that.
Yes.
If you do it, if you try to do it the other way around, then the result is, I guess, more depravity, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
So for me, it was still a hard thing to receive without having much to show for it. Like, number one, I haven't left this program, right? I've been in this place for a year and a half. Like, none of this has been tested outside of here, right? But to receive that as my new identity, for me, took some time still. It took a couple years, I would say, of wrestling with it, stepping outside of it, making some mistake, committing some sort of sin that would call it into question immediately. Like, working it out was difficult.
Same with me. I mean, when I first started learning about this whole idea of who I am in Christ, first I had to understand the difference between my soul and spirit, and I won't go into depth in that. But once I realized, okay, my spirit is where I am new, and my soul is where the sanctification process is happening, right? But even when I learned who I was in Christ, I bucked it for a while because I was just like those guys that came to the conference with you. This is dangerous.
Yeah.
This is dangerous. If I really believe this, first of all, it sounds arrogant, and I did go arrogant with it for a season, which led to some hell. So I don't know if we'll get into that story in this conversation, but this could lead to some arrogance. It could lead to some license. It could lead to all kind of stuff. So I bucked it for a long time until finally I experienced what I call crossing Jordan, right? To when I never will forget, I was in Sky Valley at the base of a waterfall by myself one morning looking up, and I experienced my identity. It went from just all this knowledge I was gaining and pushing back on and then pulling in and pushing back to where it settled into my knower. I don't know what the knower is or consciousness or whatever, but it settled in a way that was just totally undeniable. Yeah.
I've been at that waterfall and felt similar things. That's a great place.
Great place. Mud Creek Falls.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I definitely, in the addiction recovery world, there's still a lot of fear. There's still a lot of fear. And, we can get into debates all day long. Everyone debates if there's such a thing as healthy fear, and, is it a difference without distinction? Is it gradations of fear? Like, once you get to a certain point, okay, that's an unhealthy fear, but being scared of this or that, I mean, that's good, So maybe sidestepping those sorts of debates, there was still a lot of fear in me, and a lot of fear in all the men that I was around, and a lot of fear in general, that if you were to receive something that gracious, then yes, it's almost like if you combine, I'm not trying to just pick on total depravity here, but if you were to combine total depravity and then introduce grace, it's like we're so depraved, we're going to want that grace to be true. So we're going to convince ourselves that it is. And then as soon as we convince ourselves that it is, then we're done. Like, the enemy has won. He's convinced you that you're that arrogant, right? That you're that arrogant that you're going to receive, that God himself would have gone through the exact same process of incarnation and crucifixion and resurrection just for you, right? Now that's some pretty arrogant stuff, like the hubris to be like, oh, you, right? because I'm so depraved. And because we're so depraved, if we give ourselves that grace, yes, all it will be is a license. And what we will want, what we would naturally want, what we all naturally want is just drugs and sex and booze and money and, whatever, and power and prestige and status and whatever. So the place where you and I might bump into some friction would be once, I'll speak for myself and maybe other people that I've seen. Once I received it, there was a way of being able to look back and have that same grace apply to me across every season of my existence in the past, to where instead of just saying, oh, I was terribly depraved, totally depraved, and now I'm a new creation, it was also, but I don't, this gets into, can you become something that you aren't already a little bit, right? But this idea that actually what I've always been looking for is God, right? What I've always been seeking is goodness, beauty, and truth, these three transcendentals that make up the Trinity, in my opinion, and start to see that even my most seemingly depraved behaviors were still a broken, bent, twisted search for God and for the good. And this would kind of get us into,
So here's the way that I see that, okay? Yeah. We function and live in linear time. So we have these experiences of whether you're totally depraved or not, we feel it. Then we have this massive experience of grace and new birth and salvation. And then we go on this windy road to where it feels like we're going backwards sometimes. And then we get a massive jump forward. And all this has happened in time in our experience. And God does not function in our experience as far as time goes. He's outside of time. So I think when we look back and we see that every bit of our past is covered in that grace and love, and that no matter what we had experienced yet or not, we always were his son. We were always that. Now we're actually seeing through that eternal lens, and not this human lens.
Right.
So yes, our experiences, we have all this. Right. But when and I don't think a lot of people get to experience this. I think it's a small percentage of people that actually get to experience this, is they look back and say, even before I was saved, even before I was born again, when I was doing that awful, horrible thing, he still loved me right then. As much as he does right now. Right. We are now through the veil. We are in a thin space. And we are seeing with the eternal lens, right? So that's how that's kind of my thoughts on the whole idea of that.
I mean, that definitely is a solution to the rub, right, of time. And of, obviously that opens up a whole can of worms when you start talking about, can this grace apply retroactively, right? But, it reminds me of that quote, when St. Paul says that when it pleased the Lord to reveal himself in me, right? And of course, the implication of that is that he was already in there. And when it pleased him to reveal it. So that's sticky. And anytime we start talking about eternity versus time, it's sticky.
Well, yeah.
We get these these brief little glimpses of it.
Take the red pill.
Yeah, exactly. But when you go full red pill, there is a sense of looking back and forward. Like before I was able, here's an interesting thing I'd like to run by is see kind of what you think. But I think that when I said that I would not have been able to receive these kinds of revelations unless I was still in the place that I was, one of the reasons that I don't think I could have received it elsewhere is because I had to start seeing it and feeling it for other men before I could apply it to myself.
Wow.
So I shared this story in the first episode of when you get exposed to a man's full life and all of their wounds and all of their traumas and all their deep, dark secrets, the amount of empathy that wells up for this person can be intense. And this realization that, man, I hate to say this, but there are some people that they were screwed from the beginning.
Yeah.
Like you're just the amount of pain that you've gone through, I can't even comprehend.
Yeah.
And the fact that you're still here and you're still alive is a miracle.
Yeah.
And so when that kind of empathy happens, and also I alluded in the first one, when God starts to meet those men and intervene in ways, even though they don't have the structural framework of Christianity, right? These are men that hate God, that don't believe in God. And yet he's doing the exact same thing for them that he did for me or anybody else who like has, I have my doctrine in place. My theology is sound. It started to just change everything for me. Like, no, this should not be. Almost like older brother jealousy, to reference the prodigal son parable, like the older brother jealousy. Like, wait a minute here.
Yeah.
I was raised in all this. I was taught all this. And this guy doesn't believe in you at all. This guy hates you.
Yeah.
And yet you're showing up in the exact same way. In fact, maybe even more powerfully. And like this person can receive it immediately. Whereas for me, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of work, right? There's a lot, like he's got to find the cracks and get in there.
Yeah.
It started to change everything for me, flip it upside down. Like maybe I am the most pitiful person here because I actually think that I've got it, right? I think that I know, and I think that I'm qualified. So there was that. And then there is the just overwhelming empathy for these other men and realizing that like in the same way that I was hugged and that I was loved unconditionally, and that was the only way for me to then be able to see through that to the Father, to the Abba Father of us all. In the same way, I would be with a man and I'd realize I can be that for him right now. I can still point beyond myself, of course, but I can be that for him right now. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't need rejection from me. He doesn't need shame from me in order to behave differently. Like he needs unconditional love. And then as you give this to men and they respond to it and they receive it, there was a sense that like, can I look at any human creature and say, God loves you unconditionally, no matter what? Can I say that can I really do that? Can I really say that to everybody? And then it was through starting to warm up to that idea that maybe when I look in the mirror, I have a hard time applying it to myself. But when I look at all these men, it's easy. It's easy. I can say that I love you guys no matter what happened. Even when you were in your most depraved state, we know what you were looking for because we were looking for the same thing, right? And so as soon as that reality started to unfold experientially with other people, I would always then be challenged to like, well, what about, does that apply to me? Yeah. Or God would say, now what about you? Right?
Yeah.
And then again, looking back at my past and loving my former self in the same way, being gracious to my former self in the same way, having just as much compassion and realizing that what I'm doing, like you said, from that eternal vantage point, what I'm doing is the same thing that God has been doing.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it still feels arrogant sometimes to do it. And it took me, I wouldn't have talked nearly this openly about it back then. Mm-hmm. And there's some years in here, where I still felt like I was kind of living with a few secrets. And the secrets were about just how good this gospel of grace actually is, right? And that's a weird thing to feel like I'm walking on eggshells sometimes because I just can't come right out and say it to everybody. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's timing's important, right?
Sure.
There are times that it's a kairos moment. It's the right time. Mm-hmm. But I still felt like I was keeping it kind of under wraps. And of course this does rub against some theological things. I mean, we don't have to play around. There's plenty of theological things that we've already said that can, burst some bubbles or plant some dynamite in this conversation. But for me, what I'm going to end with here is all of this journeying, this path that you helped put me on, that all these men at No Longer Bound helped put me on, and Mike Harden helped put me on. One of the culminations of this was having children of my own. And I'm sorry, man, but my kids have never been totally depraved. I hate to say it, but they came out of the womb wanting God. They came out of the womb desiring what is good. Mm-hmm. They came out that way. And again, when you look at, when you start, for me, the work of going through other men's stories and counseling other men, which we talked a little bit about at the beginning, that we'll get to this stage where we start talking about counseling. Mm-hmm. But I made the comment, and you made this comment too and agreed with it, that counseling other people transforms you.
We're going to get there.
Okay.
That's where we're going next.
So all I wanted to end with then is that having children of my own has changed me so dramatically. If serving other men and counseling other men transforms me more than when I was the recipient, then parenting has transformed me more than the other two put together, and has helped me learn to love my my inner child now, plus my child back then, that grace, as I was able to give it to my kids, I was also then able to look back and give it to myself in the past. Right. Yeah. So I started to wonder what the value in holding any less concept of myself, what the value what could there possibly be in doing that? Yeah. I can look back and judge myself if I want to, but who am I judging there? Yeah. First of all, it's like a phantom. I don't even know what I'd be judging. Right. But God's not judging it, right? God had compassion on that person when I was that person. Yeah. And I can do the same with my future self somehow. It's harder. Yeah, it's harder. Because it's fluid and it's kind of a fantasy. But anyway, that helped me. I feel like the final connecting points of these revelations came through parenthood and are still coming, of course, but came through parenthood and opened up my my relationship to God and being able to see from that more eternal vantage point, and that more unconditional vantage point, because it's so unconditional, of course, right? And realize, okay, so this is actually the way that God has felt about me and maybe all of us. That's, again, where it gets controversial. But if I can look at a cross-section of 50 men, it doesn't matter where they came from, and I can feel that love, that unconditional love and empathy, and I can learn. The more I learn about their story, the more I realize that inside of them is something worth saving. Then I've had a hard time really not extending it out from there. Yeah. And has continued to ripple out from there. Because at No Longer Bound, you're dealing with the men that caused all the problems, right? It's one thing counseling, like you might get an individual who comes into your counseling center that was the recipient of all this abuse, right? And it's so much easier to empathize. It's so much easier to have compassion for that and to apply that form of grace. Like, you don't deserve this, right? We're so sorry this happened. You didn't deserve this. It's not your fault. Right. You're looking at a man saying, this was totally your fault. Right. You did this.
You did this.
I mean, I'm talking murderers, rapists. I'm talking, physical, sexual, mental abuse of all kinds, the thieves. So those were the men that we were dealing with. And to realize that even in the acts of abuse, even in the acts of total depravity, you were also being abused. You were being hurt, right? That level of empathy, I guess what I'm saying is I'm really thankful that God put me into this place where at first it was all about me. But then, even more importantly, he let me finally start to feel the same kind of love, acceptance, and worth and security that he offers us, because he put me with not the victims, but he put me with the villains. And then to see that villain as a lovable, acceptable, worthy child, as a child of God, even before they work out and clean up all the messes.
What you're saying is you were placed in an environment where you were actually called to minister to, show grace and love toward the abuser, right? Yeah. And how that's not in our nature to do, because we like to have the villain that's unredeemable, right? And then through this experience, you learned that God is redeeming this guy too, right? Okay.
Which can, of course, make one jealous and angry,
sure,
and scared,
sure.
Because then, what are we measuring here? Yeah. This is baked into Christian concepts from the very beginning.
Sure.
That we can take all of that on as us, right? And know that, God forgives that too. I mean, some of these,
we are Judas.
Exactly. So it's built into the story. If you want to relate to somebody, go ahead and pick Judas, because what that's going to do is not only make this good news even gooder, and not only cause this inner transformation in you, but it's going to change the way that you look at everyone, sure. Right? So yes, this idea that he put me not with the victims, but with the villains, then I can identify with the villains, which is one thing, but I thought the idea would be eventually then that we would kind of move out of that role, but then to stay in a place where it really freed me from all my own judgments and vows, right? Which I'm so incredibly thankful for.
Oh yeah, those suck.
They suck. Man, they suck so bad. They're so isolating, and they're so they're just so gross.
Judging other people is where we begin our pain.
Yeah.
Every single time. They hurt so bad.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to wrap up with this. so you were in your SLT, you started experiencing the message of grace in a new way, learning your identity, figuring out that you are not your brain, and you always thought you were, right? That your brain is not you, and that's freedom right there. And so then, just to kind of go into the next part of your story, I'll weave mine into it. As the years go on, basically what I was doing was taking everything I would learn from my mentors, counselors, or whatever, and I was receiving it, but then I had this sexual shame that I would go work on by myself. Right? Not letting anybody in there.
Right.
And so even though I was experiencing all these wonderful truths and intimacy with Christ and all of this, I still had this dark place in me. And I was teaching conferences, and people were getting, just like transformed through the Holy Spirit, and just a lot of stuff's happening. But yet here I am still with this broken, damaged part of me. And so these years go by where you and I are kind of journeying together. My alcoholism is slowly, progressively getting worse and worse and worse. And then as we found out, I can't remember if this was this episode or part one. I can't remember. But I ended up at No Longer Bound, right? Then I experienced you in a different way. And I really thought about this statement before I said it to you before, because I'm not exaggerating. I have never seen a gift like yours in a room of 10 people. Right? Like I've never seen you speak to 100, 150, 200. I've never seen that. I don't know if you're good. You might suck. You might be great. I don't know. But when I see a someone who is facilitating healing and truth in a room full of 10, 15 people, I've never seen a gift like yours. It is remarkable. And I've been around a lot of leaders. So you are very gifted. I never will forget, not just with addicts. Yes, I watched you in a room full of 6, 7 addicts walking us through inner healing. I saw your gifting there. But one time I showed up at a family recovery meeting, right? So now we've got the addicts in the room and the moms and a few dads.
Oh, I love those.
Yeah.
That's the best.
And I walked in, I sat behind you, and within 15 minutes, you had everybody right here in the palm of your hand, glued to every word that you were saying. Just the way that God's gift was just coming out of you, right? That's when I knew, okay, this dude has got something special. And anybody that knows you that's watching this right now, they're shaking their head going, yep. Because anybody I talk to about this, if I start talking about Scott Althauser's gift, they're like, oh, it's very unique in the way that you lead and facilitate a group. So then I started encountering that part of you, right? Talk to us about what you learned through leading, because that brings on a whole new level of both pain and revelation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big question. First of all, thank you for all those compliments. There was definitely a time where I would not have been able to receive anything you just said. And what that would have looked like is it would have looked like going from selfishness to pure selflessness and be like, hey, Jason, that none of that was me. That was
all God. Yeah.
Just God, right? I don't exist. It's not me who lives. It's just him, right? But the beauty of that exchange is it can be both and. So number one, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will receive it. And this is not a clever attempt to try to reject it as a compliment, but it does tie into the story that we were talking about in part one, which is I was really seeking this outside in, this external sign and seal. I was seeking the gifts, and I wanted them. I thought they would descend from heaven, right? And they would rain down on me and take over me in a sense, but it was always outside in. And I really was convinced that's the way that it worked. You ascend the mountain and God comes down and gives something and you bring it back down. But for me, it was bottom up and it was inside out. And so for you to mention those things, let's say about my gift, it is kind of cool. I'm glad that you used the word gift because it connected me back to my past and searching for those gifts and wanting those gifts so much. And it turns out I had all the gifts I needed. Yeah. Right? Oh, they weren't available to me. They weren't really accessible to anybody else. But there was no need to add anything to this mix. Like almost like God was saying, what more gifts do you want? Right? You haven't been able or accessible or available to exercise the gifts that you already got. Right. And maybe I just needed one, and maybe I have one, right? And maybe that's enough. But growing into that gifting, for sure, was a cool process. I love that you mentioned family recovery, because I love being with the families. I don't know how you feel about being with the families. Obviously, it can get messy. But I remember thinking, I was nervous about family recovery because, like you said, it's one thing when you've got kind of this internal incentivized audience, right, of these men in this program. But then it's like, no, their families are traveling from other states to get here, and you better give them something good, right? I don't know how you feel as a counselor. Honestly, I think about it sometimes that, like, when somebody pays for a counseling session, it feels to me like there would be pressure to be like, we better make this one good, like, otherwise, what are they? But with these families, I was given some advice by another leader that I really admired, and he gave me this advice to try this one exercise on my first family recovery.
You talking about picturing everybody in their underwear?
No.
Okay.
Have you? Does that work?
I've never tried that.
No,
That's
I've never
so
tried it either. For me, I would get so distracted. First of all, it's an ugly scene to picture, right?
Yeah.
We just don't look very good naked. I don't understand what. I mean, the fig leaves were probably just like, please, I'm just tired of looking at this thing, right? Like, it's making me nauseous. I'm trying to eat some fruit over here. So no, it wasn't picturing them naked. It was to ask everybody to do one very simple assignment. And once I did this assignment, and once I saw what happened, I remember actually having the thought, this is going to be easy, right? There's not much to this. And it ties into what I've been saying about, like, realizing that we were all formed through factors. And if we just talk about what formed us, then it's going to be simple. I mean, it's going to be simple. It's going to show itself simply. So the exercise was, have the man in the program, the resident, have them write down their answer to these two questions, and then have the parents, or really the rest of the family, whoever was there, doesn't matter who, anyone else in the family, have them also answer these same two questions, but do it separately on separate pieces of paper, and then have the family read their answer. And he said, do this and then watch what happens. And I was like, all right, I'll give this a shot. So I went in there, stood up in front of everybody, said, hey, I'm nervous. It's my first time doing this. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're just going to do a simple exercise here. We're going to see where this leads us. And so I said, hey, every man in the program, every resident of this program, answer these two questions. What did I need from my parents that I didn't get? And what did I get from my parents that I didn't need? And those are two totally different questions with totally different answers. But answer them both real quick. What did I get from what did I need from my parents that I didn't get? What did I get from my parents that I didn't need? And then once all the men in the program answered that question to themselves, I then said, now all the rest of the family members, let's just use parents as an example because it's kind of clean and easy. So the son answered this. Now the parents are answering this. So they're referring to their parents, right? So they're asking the question now. Me, the dad who came to visit my man in the program, now you're asking me, what did I need from my parents that I didn't get? And what did I get from my parents I didn't need? First of all, why am I asking that question? My parents aren't here, right? My parents might be dead and gone, and they have nothing to do with the problem, right? Like, this guy's the problem. You're here to, like, help this guy, and we're here to, like, watch you help this guy, So the parents then answered these questions. And the most bizarre and really profound connections between it just connects us one level up, right? To, if you're the resident, you're seeing that your own mom and your own dad also had the same pathways of pain that you do, and they line up, right? They might not be absolutely identical, but they're usually in the same vein. And you can see the relationship, and this is just one level up, right? So what it does, it shows the parents that they've also got very similar problems, different maybe manifestations of the symptoms. It shows the resident that he's not the only one. And if he was just blaming his parents for all this, now he can't just blame his parents for all this. Maybe he just starts blaming his grandparents. But if you had his grandparents in the room and do the same thing, which I've had grandparents in the room, I've had 3 generations of connections to this one answer. It's one question.
And then eventually we're going to get back to Adam.
We got to go all the way back. I mean, as a parent, I've realized this pretty early on where I was observing certain things in my child that I wasn't a fan of. And I was thinking, it's probably coming from me. I've been trained to look at myself first. So I'm like, it's probably coming from me. Then I go pick up my child from school one day and I'd be like, oh, all that stuff that I'm seeing, I'm now watching this kid do in an even more intense way. So I'm like, okay, my kid is picking it up from this kid.
Yeah.
So we are very absorbent creatures.
Crazy.
Right? We just mirror and mimic each other. We're mimetic creatures is the word for that. So then I would go to like a function where all the families come, and I'd realize, man, I don't dislike this little kid.
Just like his parents.
I dislike his parents. And you can see it. I'm like, oh, that's where the kid's getting all that. Like, look at the way they stand, the way they walk, the way they talk. Like, he's getting it all from them.
Billy's dad's a butthole.
Exactly. I'm sorry, Billy, but your dad, it's not you. Your dad's a butthole. And then what I'm basically saying is I don't hate this kid, and I don't hate his parents. I hate his parents' parents.
Here we go.
And then we got to go all the way back.
We might be totally depraved.
Exactly. We might have to go. Well, it depends on your definition of depravity, I guess, you know. But we do have, I would replace the word sin in this, not because I'm against the word sin, but just if we're talking about original sin, you actually told me this. I would replace the word sin with like original lack or original need.
Deficit.
Or original deficit or original dependence.
Sure.
Right? One of your phrases is 100% loved 100% of the time, 100% needy 100% of the time.
We're 100% needy 100% of the time. But we're 100% loved 100% of the time.
See, I don't even feel the need for the but. It's like we're saying the neediness is not good.
Yeah.
But don't worry, have hope. The love is good.
Yeah.
I would say, no, the neediness is good. Now, I know that it can be bad. Mm-hmm. It's dangerous, right? It's dangerous. But if one accusation can be made about God, it's that he is a gambler.
Yeah.
Because he has empowered parents so heavily.
Crazy.
I mean, to put that much power in their hands. I'm convinced, Jason, I could go home right now, and within a few hours, I can do some serious damage to my children. Like damage that might take them as long as it took me, or longer, or never recover from. And I can do it in a matter of hours. I can do it without laying a finger on them too. So whatever the audience might be picturing right now, I don't mean that.
Yeah.
I'm way more sophisticated than that.
Yeah.
I can just be like, hey, can you do this thing for me? And then watch my son do it, and then be like, hey, can you do it now only better and actually give a crap about it? And then he can do it again. I can be like, hey, can you do it more like Jimmy down the street now, please?
Now we've shaped his concept of self and his concept of God in about 15 seconds.
Exactly.
All right. So getting back to teaching,
I got way off. I didn't
okay.
even stay on the topic.
That's okay. We got about 10 more minutes. What do we do? Why is it that when we know some truths, now it's time to go teach them? Something happens. Like something beautiful and painful happens at the same time. Talk about that.
Okay. Well, number one, I made the mistake of adopting as part of my identity. I'm into the idea of using some sort of descriptors to describe maybe what makes my spirit unique from yours. And so, and again, I got this from you. I mean, this your counseling center's new name, right?
Oh yeah.
And to me, this was a very, very essential part of this whole story that we're telling. Even when you mentioned like, what did you learn through leadership? Well, one of the things I learned is that leadership without the word servant in front of it is a trap.
Absolutely.
Right?
Amen. Yeah.
And you have to learn that. I mean, it seems like you have to learn that the hard way. I don't know if there's any way to bypass the pain of that process, to learn that you're not a leader by itself. You're a servant leader.
That's right.
And that's the only way that you can really lead. I had to go through that same process you could just swap that with the term student teacher.
Ooh.
And
this is huge, right?
Yeah. And so for me, because it is a natural gift of mine from God, right? And because I put all the other quote unquote spiritual gifts that I was seeking, I put all that aside and really just started walking in my gift, the only one I really need, I guess, which you alluded to, which is this gift to facilitate. And you know what? There's other aspects maybe to it.
Teach.
And this gift to teach, sure,
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, teaching, communication, discernment, everything, all the intangibles that go into true facilitation or counseling or whatever. And I would also receive a lot of compliments, of course. You know, I would receive a compliment like, you are a great teacher. And so I got I got into teaching as a part of my identity. The word teacher would show up on my list of most identifying features or factors of myself is teacher without the word student. And it did produce the same amount of problems that the word leader produces without the word servant in front of it. And the idea is that I did stop receiving. I stopped being taught by the same things that I was teaching. I stopped being taught by people above me that I needed to be learning from. And I kind of just cut it off and said, I think I've got enough here to really go on. I could milk this for some years. And like you said, people respond to it,
Oh, yeah.
And it's kind of a mixture of, if you know you have the gift to teach, that can be enticing and seductive by itself. But also, if you have access to the truth and you watch the truth light people up, then it does become a very tempting form of self-righteousness and self-sufficiency.
For sure.
Really just, let's say self-sufficiency. Because it definitely did not feel like the self-righteousness that I used to have.
No.
But it just felt like I can go into this room and crush it.
Yep.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And 5 minutes before that, I can be arguing with my wife, right? I can whatever, and then I can just click and walk into that room and crush it because I have the truth that I believe is the truth, and I know how to teach it. Mm-hmm. And so it was some years. I mean, really, to be honest, it took God moving me around a little bit at No Longer Bound, kind of like with the Bible and other things, removing my access to teaching for certain periods of time. And then when I started to feel kind of the emptiness or the nakedness of not being in that capacity, even if it was just a season, even if it's like, hey, look, you've been doing this inner healing thing for 7 years straight. You should take some time off and stop doing it. And so I would, and then I would feel a hole, I would feel an emptiness, and the question would start to come back up. Well, who am I? Well, then what am I doing?
Yeah.
And so I remember the day, this is some years after being in a teaching role and in a leadership role where God had me scratch out the word teacher and write the word student. And even to the point of saying the only thing that ever made you a good teacher to begin with was because you have been such a good student at different times.
Yep.
And you have thrown the baby out with the bathwater here.
Yep.
And so what I want you to do is forget about teaching and be what you always were and what made you such a good, qualified to even be put in a teaching position. And that is start receiving again. Right. And it's such that it's a subtle trap, but that giving in order to get versus getting it and then giving it, that the giving and receiving cycle versus the selling and trading and, buying and selling. That was a rude awakening for me, and one that felt like it was kind of a demotion back to some prior state, but was really a promotion back into the good stuff, back into grace. And I really can feel that since then, and this is probably, I don't know, it's 10 years ago or more, but since then I have held so tightly to the identity of student. And to the point to where I would say that now as a 40-year-old man, I feel like I am more excited than ever about the sheer process of learning, about curiosity, right? And that we live in this crazy time, this unprecedented time in human history where there's more than I could ever hope to learn, right? I have access to so much. I have access to our entire Christian tradition, the 2,000 years of it, that I can be learning all of that now. Yeah. I have access to the complete Bible. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Protestantism and the printing press are coterminous. But before then, nobody had a full Bible.
Right.
You would have bits and pieces here and there. You might travel and go to a library and access this other bit. But we live, I guess what I'm saying is I feel like it is inexhaustible. And from now until I die, all that I've really been doing is collecting more books. My wife will complain about this because I'm never going to be able to read these books. But I'm just stacking them up because I'm just obsessed with curiosity and learning, which connects us all the way back to some of the statements I made at the beginning about the mystery.
Yeah.
Because that I got into a spot, this whole kind of fancy story that I'm telling about embracing my role as a teacher and the identity as a teacher, which can be hard to receive, then making it overly identifying without the student part. You saw me go through all this stuff. I mean, you would call me out on it all the time.
Yeah.
You'd be like, hey, why are you stop controlling God, right? Stop putting him in the box and stop, like formulating everything, right? And I was pretty strict and stringent as it relates to those things because I've been teaching them for so long, right? So I lost a couple things. I reprioritized a couple things that ended up producing problems. I did not have as my ultimate role all these other roles that I had. Teacher was definitely one of them. Counselor was one of them. I was an ordained minister, also a husband, also a parent, also an older brother. Plus there's all the professional roles. Son was not at the top of that list.
Wow.
Right? And what's crazy, this just happened last week. We're in a group, and there's a good friend of mine who was saying he was feeling burnout, and he's in leadership. He's in leadership in a ministry, in an addiction treatment center ministry. And so I said, give me every single role that you play on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis. Give me every single one. We filled a whole whiteboard. The word son, of course, was not on there.
Right.
And I said, now which is missing? What's missing from this board? And I don't think this person would be offended to hear me telling this story, but we sat there for quite a while, and I told him we'd probably be sitting here all day, and there is one that you will not think of.
Yep.
But what's interesting about it, what's an ironic twist, is that it's the one you were born with. It's the only one you were born with, and it's the one that you've been in the longest. And then of course just wrote the word son, and it's just like, God's that's not
son.
Even on our radar.
God's son. Yeah.
That's right. And so for me, I think the first half of my leadership career was all about growing as a teacher, growing as a leader, growing in things like confrontation, communication, compassion. And then the second half of that role has actually been, moving those down a level and putting student and ultimately son at the top of that list, which, in my opinion, is the only thing that qualifies me to be a good parent on any given day, is if that sonship, sonship is just pure receptivity. I mean, you can't do anything to earn it, right? And that's the mode that I love my son to operate in with me, is if we're walking together, you don't have to try to be anything other than my son right now. Which I'll end by saying, just as a personal aside here, just last week I was taking my son to a class, and we had a few minutes. We're sitting outside waiting for the class to start. And he said, Dad, I think when I have my own kids, I think I'm going to let my son play Nintendo a little later than you do, right? Or something like that. I don't know. It was something basic like that. I think I'm going to do it a little differently than you do it, Dad. And I was like, hey, okay, that's up to you. That'll be up to you and your kid, And then he said, Dad, did you ever think about being a dad? And did you ever think about when you would have kids? Because he basically thinks about it a lot. He alludes to it pretty often. And I said, yeah, I definitely did. And I said, you know what though? When I remember back to picturing myself being a father, I never could have imagined anybody better than you. I literally got to look at him in the eyes and say, I'm so glad that my son turned out to be you, right? I'm so thankful for that. Second, I told him that in all the time that I dreamt of being a father one day, I kind of forgot that it's also important that I'm always a son. And I could reference Papa, his grandpa. And he's like, you mean with Papa? And I was like, yeah, I mean with Papa, but I also mean with our Father, right? With God. And then lastly, as soon as I said all that, he looked back at me and was like, Dad, I'm so glad my dad was you, right? And I was like, man, this is actually the one thing that I did not picture when I'd be a father one day, right? I'm just picturing how I would help mold him or what sports he'd get into or whatever. But to have these precious moments where now, number one, the only thing that has made me qualified, I think, to be a father, which I just said, what makes me love fatherhood so much is that I've got to soak in sonship for so stinking long, right? And just soak in the sonship. But the second thing is all of this training at No Longer Bound that got me to the point that I can do the simplest thing in the world, and that's just stop everything and just love on this boy directly with that eye contact, with that touch. I mean, I hold this boy and my daughter. It might be abusive, the amount of hugs, right? I mean, they might feel that way eventually. That just you're just over hugging, over eye contact, and just stop saying you love us so much all the time, because I say it all the time. But if that's all, to just maybe end this story for today, if that's the thing that I said I experienced the first day at No Longer Bound, that then allowed me to see through those men, to see that that's also God's mode of being, to then now be able to give that to my son in a way that my dad wasn't able to give it to me because he did not get any of it from his dad. I mean, I love this man to death. I mentioned in the first episode, I want to be more like this man. But he was just set up for failure here.
Sure.
He had no resources. And so if God used my addiction to get me to a place where now I have resources that are very simple, but that are also, it's the only thing that matters. If God used my addiction for that, then I would say my addiction was an advantage. I call it the advantage of addiction. And it wasn't just that one day I'll be able to look back and say, hey, that was worth it. Things have been redeemed, restored. It was worth going through that hell to get to this heaven. It's that I actually look back and am utterly grateful for it. Wouldn't trade it for anything, and just thank God for my addiction.
Scott, I love you.
I love you too.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. And promise me you're going to come back, because you and I got some more stuff we're going to talk about.
Be careful what you wish for.
Oh, I'm
ready. You won't be able to keep me away, Jason.
I'm ready.
We haven't even got to talk about all the current stuff, you know?
I know.
I'd love to hear more about you, by the way. I was tempted throughout the conversation to ask you some questions, but
we'll do that next time.
Maybe next time I get to ask you some questions and hear more about you for
sure next time.
All right.
Love
Sounds
you, man.
Good. Love you.